welcome back to the Down to the Wire podcast. We are back here again, ready to review what was, I think, a fantastic race in the Formula One season, carrying on from the good work in Bahrain. Jack, how you doing?
I'm really good. It's a great week for sport. Well, maybe not a great week for sport, but it's a dramatic week for sport.
Yes.
With what's happening in the football. But I don't think that has 100% overshadowed what that race was all about, because that the quality of that race was night and day from the Imola of last season. So
it was, yeah. I mean, before we go right into the Formula One stuff, it's worth saying we're going to be doing another episode this week talking purely about the Super League carnage. If you're a football fan, why not come back and listen? Because we'll be having a chat about that. But yeah, sticking with the Formula One for this episode. Yeah, absolutely fantastic race. We had a bit of rain, bit of the wet stuff made it a bit more interesting at the start.
And to be fair, that is bang on. If somebody said picture perfect conditions to start a race, not picture perfect, but fans' perspective,
entertainment,
yeah, you want just a little dabble of rain where nobody knows what to do 100%, and there's the risk of more rain, which means it could be worth taking a gamble, and also the risk that there's no rain and it's going to dry up and you could really choose the wrong option. I think we saw a lot of some good, some bad strategies this weekend. Good conditions for a good race.
You know, we'll come on to it later, but like you said, because of the rain, there was threat of more rain. There was also the fact that, like, at the start of the race, they were like, "Oh, well, this part of the circuit is really wet, but this part is fine." So, do you go on the wet tyre and be quicker in the wet sections, and then just suffer in the faster sections where it's dry?
That is something which is often unspoken about in Formula One, is the genuine size of these circuits. I mean, especially when you consider a place, say, like Monza, where the circuit is probably, well, it's mostly straight lines pretty much all the way around. But if you're going to make a straight line speed circuit interesting,
it's long.
Yeah, it's got to be really long. So,
yeah.
You could be covering 2-3 kilometres between one end of the track and the other. And the conditions, weather-wise, could be completely different in one place to the other. I know often in Hockenheim they always had that issue where...
Yeah.
In the Eiffel Grand Prix, if they were ever using more of the Nürburgring when they were doing that circuit. But, there's quite a lot of circuits where you can really find interesting conditions from one side to the other.
Yeah, and I mean, as a result then, you also had, because of the threat of more rain, you had some people going, do we go on the Inters and then see how it goes? You had some people gambling, going on to the wets. And so, yeah, the rain just adds that little bit of unpredictability, I think. But I think, like you said, it was, in terms of entertainment, it was just enough to make it interesting without hindering. Because sometimes when it tips it down, you're like, oh, this is just going to be rubbish. Because they're having to crawl around.
Absolutely.
But yeah, no, it was... from the very start, to be honest, it was amazing. It was a cracking race.
You consider turn 2, just straight away action. it was like you obviously you're going to get overtakes at the start of a Grand Prix, but just from turn 2 instantly you're seeing cars fly off the track, and you're like, yes, we're already in for a good race.
We'll start at the start then, I guess. So as you said, it was fairly wet. And I guess we'll start with the victor, shall we? Spoilers, if you don't know the result of the Grand Prix, you've had enough time to watch it by now, by the time this has been released, I guess.
Yeah. Why are you listening to a Grand Prix review if you haven't watched the race? That's the big question.
Gosh, listener. Perhaps they just want a rundown. Listener. Gosh.
Spoiler.
Verstappen won the Grand Prix. Bit of smart thinking by him. He, was in Hamilton, was on pole, obviously. And Verstappen managed to ping both Perez and Hamilton off the start. Apparently he started in second gear, which is very, very clever. Because it means Well, yeah, I mean, I guess it gives you less wheel spin in the trickier conditions. So, I mean, there's the potential that you could, like in commentary, they often say, "Oh, they've bogged down," because you've not got quite enough power to kind of get away. But because of I guess normally in normal circumstances you'd have a bit more of a sluggish start, but given the wet conditions, it's a lot more difficult to kind of balance in first gear because you've got so much power. So yeah, genius by Verstappen, really. And yeah, they both got their elbows out, didn't they? Into turn one, Hamilton and Verstappen.
That's exactly what you want to see.
Yeah,
it was like following on from Bahrain, where particularly about 3 laps towards the end when Verstappen actually took the lead and had to give it back, it was like you were seeing some good driving. People sort of pushing each other off the track a little bit and all that. And Verstappen, to be fair, it was wet, so you don't know how much control he had of the car. And they did note that in the FIA, where they were like, if that was dry conditions, you could possibly say Verstappen's not given Hamilton enough space, because through that first turn, he's on the inside and then just goes straight to the apex to the other side. But because of the rain, I think that completely is understandable, because it is, particularly for the first lap, you're going to have colder tyres enough the remainder of the race. So it was understandable.
I'll be honest with you. I think it was. I didn't have any issue with it, even if it had been in the dry.
I thought it was good driving. Yeah,
even in the dry, I wouldn't have had any issue with it. As in, I think perhaps at one point in that corner, Hamilton would have been slightly ahead, ever so slightly. But there's a part of me that thinks, well, Verstappen's on the racing line, and I think it was always just a little bit of a punt from Hamilton, to be honest, which nearly cost him, because he lost a bit of his front wing. But as in, I think Hamilton just thought, right, if I can hang it on the outside, perhaps Max will give me enough space to kind of stay alongside. But Verstappen wasn't having any of it. But it was completely legal. There was nothing dirty about it whatsoever.
And we saw those big curbs which we spoke about in the previous show, where instantly first turn, Hamilton's driving around like he's on a camel or something, and he was going up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down. It was like, you sensed there was a touch of the old car missing after the excursion.
You could feel it, couldn't you, as you were watching it on TV? You're like, oh gosh, that looks violent.
And that there is why you quite like the idea of having these. Well, if you're not going to have strict track limits, where you could arguably say, Hamilton's gone off the track, for instance, to stay ahead, it's like put a couple of curbs like that there. It's like, you're not going to gain any advantage. I think we saw it multiple times throughout the race. I think Perez had a duel with Vettel during the midpoint of the race, and
he bumped over, didn't he?
He went, I know exactly where Perez is going to end up going if I stick on my line, and he did, and Perez went over those curbs, and although Perez got ahead, instantly had nothing to go because he couldn't carry any speed after you go over those curbs, and Vettel took the position straight back.
Well, yeah, and like we saw some pictures from qualifying, didn't we? I think there was one with Leclerc where he's basically airborne from where he's bumped over one of those curbs and all 4 wheels are off the ground. So, yeah. And going on from that, to be honest, I think the... just briefly, we haven't really put it in the notes, but I think the track limits thing, I think it clearly worked very well. I think
on occasion people can say, yes, Sonoda.
I think he was the only... Sorry, in the race now. So, Norris got pinged for it in qualifying. In fact, I think a few did in qualifying, but I don't think that was them.
But he was the notable one because he lost.
Yes.
Was the biggest loss?
And because he got up to second, and then because he was deemed to have exceeded track limits, he dropped back down to 7th, which was his initial fastest lap. There were a few. I think Stroll maybe at one point had a time deleted, but I think in that circumstance it was because of people just pushing hard.
To be fair, if you're going to have a circuit where you almost want them to be a little bit more lenient on track limits, it probably is Imola, purely because of how narrow it is. That is not a modern day Formula One circuit in the sort of usual characteristics where it's wider, it has a little carry more speed. That is an old school one where the cars can pretty much turn on a point at quite high speeds.
I mean, they seem to be managing the... I'm not even going to try and remember the name of it. The only corners I can remember from Imola are Tosa and Acqua Minerale, but I have no idea where they are because they sound impressive. But it's that one that kind of sweeps. It's like almost like a curved corner. It kind of sweeps downhill and it seemed like a few cars were kind of running wide
Oh
there.
yeah.
Where Norris
That was
got
that
basically.
that downhill. That was 2 turns before the end.
Yes.
But that was where the DRS zone was, which we spoke about on the preview show, which was why you saw quite a few cars, I think, pushing it, and then ended up on the sand and really scuppering their chances. And to be honest, if you actually looked at the finishing positions of the drivers, you did tend to find that the more skilled drivers were at the front because they didn't make any mistakes, not because they were doing great overtakes. And it was guys like Gasly and Tsunoda, just to name a few, that were sort of making the mistakes because they perhaps had less experience than the guys like Carlos Sainz, Verstappen. I know Hamilton made a mistake, and he is probably the third or second most experienced driver in that group on the grid. But yeah, it definitely was a day for the more experienced drivers. I mean, we even saw Kimi Räikkönen get all the way up to 9th place by the end. I mean, he has since subsequently had a 30-second penalty, which has put him down to 11th, I think. So he's lost his 2 points.
Okay.
But that was because of something under the safety car rather than any, track reasons. So unfortunate for him, but definitely a day for the more experienced drivers.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, there were a lot of goings on in the race, which I guess we'll kind of cover that as we kind of move further down the grid, I guess. Do we want to speak about Hamilton next, or do we want to talk about... Because I guess by talking about the next thing we've got on the notes, we're kind of giving away something that we're going to talk about later.
Well, we'll just talk about Hamilton and in the context of Verstappen firstly, I think.
Okay.
Well, I sort of put in the notes, was the race sort of handed to Verstappen? Because to be fair, by the end of the race, I think he had something like a 20-odd second lead. And, well, it was actually shaping up to be a very interesting race. I think what happened was everybody had pitted. I think Hamilton and Verstappen were both on a set of mediums, and they were working their way through the back markers. Verstappen was getting held up a little bit, so his 5-second lead went down to about 1.5 seconds. Then Hamilton was getting held up a bit, and then it went back up to about 3 to 4 seconds. And sort of, you got the vibe that Hamilton was getting a little bit frustrated behind some of those back markers, pushed a little bit too keenly, and especially on a track which wasn't 100% dry, as we've been saying, you very easily lose control, and that's what Hamilton did. Goes off the track, goes across the sand, hits the wall, and he was able to continue, but at that stage, I think he was,
I'll be honest with you, when that happened, I was like, he's out. There's no way he can recover this.
I was surprised he recovered it, because he was pretty much stationary for more than 10-15 seconds, just trying to get something going.
I mean, it's a tricky one, because they discussed it in commentary. Where Hamilton went off, there isn't really, in terms of passing back markers, there isn't really a good way of doing it, because, if Russell goes onto because it was Russell who he was trying to overtake, if Russell goes onto the wet stuff, then he's putting himself at risk.
Yeah.
So Russell just kind of slowed down, not like bang on the racing line, but kind of stayed fairly on the racing line and just like clearly slowed down as if to say, look, go past me. Which meant that Hamilton kind of had to go onto the wet stuff. That's very rare for Hamilton, as in Hamilton is normally an absolute master when it comes to wet conditions, but, I guess he is human after all.
To be honest, what's been interesting is we've spoken pre-season about the fact that Verstappen has a tendency to be rash in some decisions he makes, which does tend to cause him to crash or spin out, and that can really cost him the race in some situations. But he's pretty much driven flawlessly for the first 2 rounds, and it's surprisingly Hamilton to make the first mistake of the 2 this season. Do you think perhaps there's an element that Verstappen's calmed down a bit, and perhaps Lewis, in a sense, has always had these sort of tendencies in him, but because he hasn't had the pressure of Verstappen this close to him before, that we're starting to see him perhaps make more mistakes? I know it's only one, but...
I think... we'll start with Verstappen. I think for Verstappen, the main thing is that he's got a car that can compete. It's as simple as that. So he's not having to do things.
One of the things they were mentioning in Bahrain about his car being able to compete was the fact that he had a lot of control of it. It wasn't really shaky like it was last year, where you become out of a turn and really having to wrestle with it. Whilst Mercedes probably do have a car which is a bit less stable this season.
It's less predictable than the Red Bull at the moment. It seems. In terms of Hamilton, I kind of get what you're saying, but I don't think it was that Hamilton was eager to get past Russell there. I just think it was one of those ones where, Russell kind of pulled to the side and Hamilton is kind of like, well, I'll just overtake him then. I think he just misjudged it. I don't think there was any sort of desperate need at that point to get past. Mm-hmm. It is also worth considering as well that Hamilton did have minor damage to his front wing anyway. And that's not to say that affected him massively, but I guess it is something to kind of bear in mind. I guess what you're seeing at the moment is that Verstappen is in the quicker car for the first time in his career. Hamilton is still in a very quick car, but perhaps not quite as quick. And I think basically, and by the over the course of a season, I feel like these sort of things balance themselves out. Yeah. I'm sure at some point we'll see Verstappen do something, not necessarily bump his front wing off like Hamilton did, but perhaps he'll run wide or he'll,
to be fair, actually, he almost span.
Well, this is the thing,
laps, didn't he?
Yeah, that's what I mean. Look, I wouldn't say that the race was handed to Verstappen because I think, firstly, he managed to get from third to first quite quickly. So he had a lot of work to do off the start, and he did it very well. And I think the red flag, as soon as you get that red flag, it kind of wipes out any sort of momentum that you've got. Your tyres cool off, which, as we saw with Verstappen, can almost be very costly. Mm-hmm. So I would say that Verstappen...
Well, the red flag actually let everybody change tyres, so those were actually fresh tyres when he did that.
Yeah, I guess so, but still,
still cold. Yeah, still cold.
Still cold because you're having to do the lap behind the safety car.
Absolutely.
But I think, I guess it was handed to Verstappen in the sense that he wasn't being put under pressure by Hamilton all the time. But as in terms of the race win itself, I would say that it was deserved by Verstappen. And even before they got to the back markers.
He didn't win that race on the basis that Hamilton crashed. And he was the leader.
Yeah, and even before Lewis had his spin, not spin, sorry, he knocked his front wing off. The gap was fairly consistent, as in it would kind of
it was going down, if anything.
Yeah, it was kind of just starting to creep under, but nothing. It's not like Verstappen got ahead and then Lewis was like taking chunks out of him. It was kind of staying around the 5-second mark.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it would go up a little bit, then it would drop a little bit. So I think Verstappen's well worthy of the win, to be honest.
That's good. Speaking of Hamilton, though, a bit further on, he did crash. He went as low as 8th. He got lapped by some of the members of the grid during his excursions off the track.
Yeah.
He finished second by the end of the race. Do you think he was very fortunate? I mean, he could have been... Well, being that he was 8th and lapped at one stage, when the red flag obviously came out because of the Russell and Bottas crash, which we'll talk about later, he was able to unlap himself and not just that, in a sense, start just behind everybody again. So there was no time deficit for him, in a sense.
No.
If they hadn't had the red flag, I don't think there was a chance he's finishing in the top 5. Do you think he's been very fortunate in this situation?
Well, look, I don't think there's any doubt he's been fortunate, is there? As in, just purely
this is the
on
sort of luck, though, that Red Bull wanted to go their way, I imagine.
Yeah, and I mean, look,
especially when you look at a race last week where Prez, well, he did have a safety car to get himself onto the back, but had to go for everybody. And have to do the extra pit stop, which was always an inconvenience. But Hamilton being able to
Yeah.
Not just get the red flag to catch everybody up, but also he didn't have to go into the pits to change anything because he could have done that under the red flag. There's a lot going for him in that scenario, I felt.
Yeah, there was. I mean, it depends on how you look at it, doesn't it? As in, I think you could also turn around and say Verstappen was very lucky to lose his car where he did, because if he had done that, a couple of corners later, he's got off the grid flying past him because it was only because they were before the line with he is in control after the safety car goes in. Leclerc could have, Leclerc was just sat there kind of like, all right, I've got to wait for him. But as in, if that had been, sort of 5 or 6 seconds later,
well,
on
a similar thing happened to Perez in the race where he went wide under a safety car. 2 cars overtook him, and the commentator was saying the rule was that if by waiting for the car to re-enter the track, you are putting yourself in harm's way, in a sense, you are allowed to overtake them, and that is then your position. And I guess in this scenario, I don't think Verstappen was off the track or spun to a degree where Leclerc had to stop.
Well, and they were going so slowly as well. They, as in they were crawling. But I guess what I'm saying is in, Hamilton had a bit of luck. Verstappen also had a bit of luck. I think Hamilton had a bit more luck.
Yeah.
But I mean, at the end of the day, as in this season more than any other season, really, as in getting from where Hamilton was to second was probably about as big a task as it's been for Hamilton ever, really, when you think about how, we'll come on to Norris in a little bit, but the Norris and McLaren were absolutely flying. The Ferraris, the big surprise of the weekend for me, really, is in they were looking really, really fast. So he still had a lot of work to do.
That was probably the most stellar Hamilton thing I'd seen of him for quite a while, in a sense. Like, in terms of stellar moments, he's gone, I'm 8th, and I'm going to overtake everybody apart from Verstappen, because Verstappen's going to get too big of a lead to get the chance. Yeah. That was
it was damage limitation. Drive. It was damage limitation. As soon as he hit that wall, as in, you look at it and you were just like, it's just a case of how far Lewis can get up the grid now and manage the deficit. I was going to say something else, but I've completely lost my trail of thought. I'm doing what you did last week.
Yeah.
But yeah, Hamilton was a little bit lucky. He had a lot of work to do. And it's also worth considering, like, when you consider, Bottas was in 9th. And he was stuck behind. I know he didn't have the DRS, and obviously the DRS does make a big difference. But, he was stuck behind Stroll for lap after lap after lap after lap, and nearly got overtaken by Russell outright, which we'll come on to later. Nearly got overtaken Russell outright in the Williams. I think you saw the best of Lewis Hamilton on the weekend. And I don't know, like, as soon as the restart happened, he was just in the zone. Like, because they were staying with him for like a couple of laps. Well, maybe not a couple of laps, but they were staying with him for like a lap or so, and then they switched into the car, and then they jumped back, and like he was just nailing every single lap. Yeah, and he was very much in the zone.
I think when he got to 6th, when he just taken Danny Rick, which he actually took remarkably easily. Compared to what it took to overtake Norris. But even when he got to 6th, they said, Norris is on the softs. We think he's going to be slow towards the end of the race.
Yeah, so that's what they
knew at that stage, when he was 6th with something like 15 laps to go, we're going to finish second.
Second is the aim.
It was like, to be fair, there's arrogance and there's confidence. And I think we just saw confidence. A killer on the track, in a sense.
Yeah, of course, just absolute instinct. I mean, the other way you could look at it is that Bottas and Russell were the ultimate wingmen.
Yeah. It's like, hey, Bottas, you're pretty much driving for 2 points right now. Why don't you collide with our other Mercedes driver and get Hamilton back up to the pack, eh?
Go on, do it for the lads.
Right. I'll push him on the grass. Toto, don't worry. Got him.
Anyway, we'll get on to that in a minute. I don't know whether you were going to say something else before we...
what do you make of being able to unlap yourself under safety cars and red flags? Do you think that's okay?
It
is a tricky one, I think, in the sense it's like, because you want competitivity, and if they aren't letting them unlap. In a sense, you just got someone who's, in a sense, overtaking people, but then might even get
I'll be honest
flagged.
with you. Well, I think the problem they've got is, I think under the safety car, it could cause absolute carnage. Because you think the cars that have been lapped...
Well, they're allowed to do that, aren't they, under the safety car? They are allowed to fly past...
No, yeah. No, but what I mean is in... If you had a scenario where they weren't allowed to unlap themselves...
Oh, okay, yeah.
As soon as the safety car went in, the leader of the race would control the speed. Yeah, and then you'd have, like, say, for example, you had Hamilton in 8th, and then the car behind him is 5th. As soon as Verstappen goes, the car that's 5th can fly off, but Hamilton has got to let that car pass because of technically it's blue flag.
Yeah.
So I think
maybe they say no blue flags for like 3 laps, like they do with the DRS, and say from now on it's fair game.
But then you could argue then you're losing the advantage of being 5th anyway, aren't you? Because if you're 5th behind Lewis Hamilton, who's in 8th, you're then having to race Lewis Hamilton just to keep up to pace with 4th, despite... I guess what I'm saying is it would get quite messy.
Yeah.
It would get very messy. Although, what I would say is I'm surprised that they did... I thought they were going to do a grid start when they did the red flag.
I thought that as well. I didn't think it was that wet.
Which seems a little bit bizarre. I don't know why they decided to do the behind the safety car, but there we are.
I mean, the best part of a race is the start. So to have another start, great. It was very disappointing that they were...
And I guess the thing that I would say, is I get what you're saying about, is it fair? Like, for example, in Hamilton's scenario, as in...
Like, in a sense, he's gained something like...
It's a gift, isn't it?
3
It's an absolute
minutes.
gift. Yeah, it's a gift. But then, how fair is it that, for example... I don't know who was in second at that point. It was Leclerc, I think, wasn't it? Was it Leclerc?
Yeah, it was Leclerc.
If Leclerc has gone on a strategy with the mindset of, we're going to catch Verstappen at the end and do a really long second stint... Mm-hmm. And then all of a sudden there's a red flag, and Verstappen can change his tyres to go onto the softs. You're kind of there like, well, hang on, that's undermined my...
They can also go on the softs as well and go, here we go.
They can.
But strategy-wise,
it depends on which side you're looking at it. Some things will benefit other people, other things will benefit others. I think it kind of balances out. Although... I get what you're saying, isn't it? It was fortunate for Hamilton, but I guess...
Or even just set the cars off in intervals of when they were actually on the track, in a sense.
Yeah.
You send off Verstappen, say 20 seconds later, send off Norris, second later.
The thing I would say with Hamilton is that, okay, he managed to gain back that time from being a lap down, but then he still has an awful lot of work to finish second. So I think he's into it either way.
Cool.
Moving on to third then, flipping... Lando Norris.
Did you know that is... I can't remember what the numbers it is, but Lewis Hamilton was like person number, say, 699, and Norris was like the 700th Brit to ever get on the podium. It was. I can't remember what the two numbers were, but Hamilton was something 99, and Norris was the new number, in a sense, the next 1,000 in a sense, or 100.
Yeah, I mean...
which was good.
As in, the first thing I'd say is that he's managing to get a lot more out of his McLaren than Danny Rick is, which has surprised me, to be honest.
An alarming amount. I mean, going back to qualifying, like we were saying earlier, he was second, and he would have been second if that time stood. Obviously, you don't know how much time he's gained by going that little bit off the track.
But he was still purple in the first 2 sectors.
Exactly. So he was clearly one of the fastest around that track without the fastest car. So it will be interesting to see if McLaren are able to keep a hold of him. But, I mean, so far, he is probably the third best driver on this grid so far this year.
He's third in the championship. I mean...
there we go.
The thing is, as well, he was behind Ricciardo at one point, because obviously his time got deleted.
Yeah. Which
meant that even though he was... you could tell he was one of the fastest ones, he was below his teammate Ricciardo, who was in 5th, I think.
Yeah.
And so, I think eventually Norris caught up to Ricciardo on track.
Yeah. And they actually said, Norris, you go ahead.
Well, he asked, didn't he? He said, look, can I go ahead? Because I think I'm going to be quicker. And, let's be fair, drivers say that all the time.
Yeah.
All the time.
But then, within the space of 3 laps, he was about 4 seconds ahead, wasn't he?
Well, yeah, eventually, at one point, he, pulled a 12-second gap. And you're like, they're in the same car.
I know. It was
Fair
wrong.
play to the guy. He had an absolute. He had a stormer of a performance. I mean, the thing that I think with McLaren, and maybe this is a little bit unfair, I don't understand why after the red flag they put him on the softs. I don't understand that.
Well, what I think Martin Brundle, or was it Ted Kravitz on the commentary, was saying was this was their opportunity to overtake Leclerc. In a sense, if they didn't think they were as quick down the straight, and the straight is one of the few areas you can actually overtake on that circuit.
Yeah, just go hard or go home, I guess.
Get on the softs, get ahead of him early, and then you haven't got to worry about him again. And to be fair, if all things are equal, they worked. He finished second. But as a long-term strategy, I don't think it was going to work because...
No.
I don't think anybody thought soft tyres are going to really do you well for 20 laps. I think you had to think at that stage, mediums are going to be the long-term option. But he did finish ahead of Leclerc. He did finish ahead of Sainz. And he only lost out to Hamilton with about 3 laps to go.
Yeah, and let's be fair, that was Hamilton just on an absolute charge. And yeah, I mean, I guess it's difficult to say, isn't it? As in, like you said, if he had gone on to the mediums, okay, he may have been quicker towards the end, but as in he may not have had enough to get past Leclerc. I mean, and it's worth noting as well, as in, like, even though he was on the kind of slower tyres, I don't think at any point you looked at it and went, Leclerc's going to have him here.
No, not at all. Because, I mean, what really he should have done was let Leclerc constantly be a second behind him. Because Hamilton couldn't get past Leclerc as long as Leclerc had DRS from Norris by being within the second. Because the only way Hamilton was overtaking me was because of the DRS. So, for about 3 or 4 laps, there was a stage where it was Norris, Leclerc, Hamilton, all
catching each other,
all less than a second between each. So it meant that Hamilton just couldn't overtake. And it was only when Leclerc, I think, went to 1.3 seconds or something like that.
Yeah, he dropped out of Norris's DRS.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and Hamilton had him easy, and then it was Hamilton onto Norris next. And, but to be fair, nobody gave. Well, apart from Verstappen, you could say, but you didn't actually see them go properly head to head, apart from the first turn. But in terms of Hamilton overtaking 6 drivers, nobody gave him a harder time than Norris.
No,
3 laps in a row, Hamilton had the DRS on him.
Yeah, on
straight, and he outclassed him every time.
Yeah, on dying softs as well.
Softs, against some nice mediums. But
yeah. I think eventually
it
was one of those things where it was inevitable. I think eventually, as in like each lap, Hamilton was getting a little bit closer, and then eventually it just kind of happened. I think. Yeah.
What was unfortunate for Norris was, I mean, it happened with like 3 laps to go, so there was a real chance that he could have potentially held on. But I remember he said there's something slipping. He said to his guys, he said it's your left hand, it's flicking on something on the car, and it kind of just put him off in a sense because it was stuttering the car a touch, and he was saying he's losing something or other. I don't know what in particular because I'm not a Formula 1 driver, but it was on that lap that I think all of the laps prior, which he had held Hamilton off, I think he was going into that straight with about 0.7, 0.8 lead, and he was able to stop him every time from overtaking with that. But on that lap where he had a little bit of an issue, I think it dropped to 0.5 or 0.6, and that was enough for Hamilton to get past.
Yeah.
So very unfortunate for him. I was really gutted because I do feel like he deserved second place for the day.
Well, I mean, I guess the thing is as well, is in like he was probably looking at it as Hamilton was perhaps getting ever so closer. He was probably thinking like, if I really wanted to, I could probably hang the car out and just kind of hope for the best, which is the sort of thing you
track.
It's high risk, isn't it? And I guess that's the sort of thing you do when you're kind of 2 races from the end fighting for position in the championship. But as in for McLaren right now,
no point in taking risks at this stage. Get your points, get home.
Exactly, just get points. And I get what you're saying about Norris. You know, perhaps a little error or a little bit of, you know, not a mistake, but you know what I mean. But as in,
it was just a hazard of the race.
I feel like Hamilton was catching him anyway. I really do. As in, I feel like at some point, if it had really got to it, I think Hamilton would have tried something regardless. As in, there were a few times, right, like Hamilton kind of pulled out, and you were like, I think if he'd really wanted to, Hamilton could have tried it there. But I think he was just looking at it and going, no, if I wait another lap or so, I can really ping him in a much more straightforward fashion.
Yeah.
It's kind of what I thought. Moving on to... Oh, sorry, go on.
before really, because I haven't really put in the notes about Ricciardo, but what do you think McLaren's verdict is on him after 2 races? He's not been particularly pacey, and Norris has been the superior of the two so far. Do you think?
It's worth considering that Norris has been in basically the same car for 3 years now.
But I wouldn't have said Carlos Sainz was that much better than Norris when he was there. What is it about? Well, do you think it's that Norris has improved that much, or do you think it's Danny Rick perhaps? Or I was going to say, did Sainz look this good this early, or rather this bad this early on in his McLaren career? But truth be told, I can't remember what scenario he was in when he joined McLaren at that stage.
I mean, I don't think Ricciardo has actually been that bad. And let's not forget, he qualified 5th. Behind the 2 Red Bulls, Lewis Hamilton, and who qualified 4th? Was it Gasly?
No, I thought Gasly was 5th, if I'm honest. I thought Ricciardo might have been 6th. Probably Leclerc or someone. I don't know if you said Leclerc.
Oh, it might have been Leclerc, actually. Let me have a look.
But I'm pretty sure Leclerc started 4th, finished 4th.
One. Sorry, I've just seen some big news about the Super League. I'm not going to go into that now, though.
Is it 4th?
Let me have a look.
Leclerc 4th?
Hang on.
Right.
Wait.
Right.
Oh, it's only got the blinking results. Qualifying, here we go. Yes. So, Danny Rick was in 6th. There we are. So it was Hamilton, Perez, Verstappen, Leclerc, Gasly, Ricciardo. So, not horrendous qualifying by Ricciardo.
Although in the race, he has finished close to, he's 20 seconds behind Carlos Sainz. He's closer to Pierre Gasly, who did have a pretty much a stinker. I didn't think it was the Daniel Ricciardo we thought was going to be coming to McLaren. He hasn't shown himself as of yet.
No, it hasn't been. It hasn't been vintage yet, but give it a bit of time.
It's a long season.
Yeah, as in we're only 2 races in. They're tricky circuits, Bahrain and particularly Imola. It's not and it's not one that's done regularly either.
When it came to qualifying, I don't know why. I'm starting to feel like I'd prefer Q3 to be 15 minutes long rather than 10, especially on a circuit like that where it's very narrow because it's not really a modern day circuit. You get if you have 1 lap time where you've exceeded track limits, you're only going to get one more chance. On a circuit like that, which is just so hard technically, that's why you see guys like Bottas finishing as low, qualifying as low as they did. It's like I just prefer 15 minutes because it means everybody gets at least 3 stints. But yeah, that's my opinions on qualifying. Anyway, should we move on to Ferrari P4, P5?
We shall.
Probably. I'll be honest. I think they have finished better than this last season. I think they had a 3rd and a 5th last season at one stage.
Was that Turkey?
Yes, it was Turkey. Where Leclerc actually lost a podium and ended up 5th on the last 2 turns or something. It was like nuts. I don't know how on earth he did that. But in terms of an all-round complete weekend, that's probably their best one since the 2019 season, in my opinion. I mean, they qualified well. They raced well. They didn't make any mistakes.
Well, you say they qualified well. Sainz qualified 11th.
Oh, good point. Well, there we go. He raced
he had an absolute storm in the race, as in he managed to get up to 5th, which is 6 positions, but as in the gaps between those positions was monumental.
Yeah, but I mean, I think we haven't had this much competitivity between the teams in the top 10 for quite some time. In terms of this is about as good in terms of people say, these leagues are competitive, but sometimes those leagues are full of rubbish cars or rubbish teams if it's in another sport. But this right now is super competitive, but also everybody's performing super well. And to be fair, somebody has to finish 11th. It's like there's 12 good teams. Oh, sorry, not 12 good. 12 good drivers or in good cars. So somebody had to, and unfortunately it was Sainz. So maybe it looked bad on that side of things. But what was almost polar opposite to last year was every race you'd see a a Ferrari crash out, a Ferrari strategy where you just end up having Vettel doing 50 laps on a set of used mediums. You're like, what is going on there? Leclerc mounted for Vettel in Austria, taking off his rear wing. It's like, this is just so 2020 Ferrari in the sense of you didn't see them in the race. They just drove comfortably, drove well. Charles Leclerc ended up finishing where he started, which was a good for the race. When you consider Perez went off a few times, Bottas ends up colliding with Russell. There's cars flying off the track and spinning left, right, and centre. Really technical circuit. To get those two guys to get to the end with no drama, nothing about them. Yeah, it's a good weekend for them. It's just what they needed.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, the Carlos Sainz, as in last weekend, he said something along the lines of, he was taking it a bit easy. I feel like perhaps this weekend he was put in a position where he kind of had to pull something out of the bag, I guess, didn't he? In order to kind of get a good finish, really, isn't he? Started 11th, finished 5th. Like you said, I think for Ferrari as a team, is probably their most complete weekend, since 2019, like you said. I think you can see that Leclerc Sainz is a good partnership.
Non-confrontational at all.
Yeah, and I think I don't think we're going to talk about him particularly because he had another kind of meh race, but Vettel doesn't look like he's up to much. And again, it's like one of those things. Like I think I said this when I can't remember when it was now, but the longer things go on where Vettel isn't getting results, the more and more you think like
it wasn't. The car.
Yeah, it wasn't the car.
It was the car, but it was Ferrari that killed him in a way.
Yeah,
but it was Ferrari's fault, but at the same time, it's Vettel's responsibility to sort it out, and he just hasn't got it anymore. I don't think. He just looks so far. He doesn't have the answers. Before he had you see these more experienced drivers and you go, yeah, they've got something in them. They can pull this out. But the new breed of drivers coming through just have so much flavour to them in a sense where they're willing to... I mean, you look at Yuki Tsunoda, the attitude of the guy coming into the sport, and it's just great to see. These guys got so much more about them, more ego. And it's meaning that these more experienced guys can't get away with just being cool and calm on the track. They're getting left behind to the more exciting new drivers.
I mean, in terms of where the teams seem to be at the moment, I think you'd probably have Red Bull top, followed very, very closely by Merc. Who would you have next then?
That is an insanely tough question because I would say the McLaren car is better.
But in terms of the drivers...
the pure consistency that we've seen from the Ferrari drivers at this stage, it really is a tricky one, that. It depends if Norris can continue this form. Because if Norris can continue this form, I think McLaren will finish third, because I think at some point Ricciardo will work it out. But the fact that Sainz has gotten off to the start he has at Ferrari, and Leclerc is consistently... I mean, is that 2 fourths in a row for him? Or at the very least, it's a fifth and a fourth or something like that. But Leclerc's driving well, makes no mistakes, and it's just like, well, on that, you'd assume that it's probably going to be Ferrari.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is worth mentioning that, Imola would be a track that suits Ferrari more than McLaren.
Do you think?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think as soon as you get a straighter circuit, you're going to have the Merc power unit really kind of coming into its own against the Ferrari. Because the Ferrari's not as much of in terms of power unit, it's not as much of a pushover as it was last year. But I still don't think it's quite as powerful as the Merc engine. And, I think when Danny Ricciardo kind of gets into the zone, I would still, out of those 4 drivers, I'd still have him as the best driver, personally. So I think we'll have to wait and see what happens on that one. But right now, it's looking a lot closer than, as in my head at the start of the season, you probably had Merc and Red Bull kind of on their own. Then you had McLaren kind of in a bit of a limbo, kind of not close to the top two, but far away from the rest. And then the rest of them just kind of fairly close together.
Yeah. Sorry, can you say it again?
Yeah, so I said, as in I think at the start of the season, you had kind of Red Bull and Ferrari on their own. Then you had maybe McLaren kind of far off those two. And then you had kind of the rest kind of lingering behind. Whereas in actual fact, Ferrari and the rest of the pack actually seem to be a lot closer to McLaren than I would have anticipated.
Yeah. Yeah, you would have assumed because of how good the McLaren car was in the past, putting a better engine in was only going to lead to them being quite far and away better than the rest of the pack because of how tight it was. But yeah. To be fair, though, we have said this about Ferrari in the past where they do have all the components of a good car. They just didn't have the engine.
Yeah.
So now that they have the engine, it's... in a sense, you can see why they've kept up. I mean, I guess we are surprised that AlphaTauri are sort of showing pace. They haven't had the results as of yet. But yeah, they're showing the pace. So maybe that's the Honda power unit showing its colours.
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah, but it is a lot tighter than we thought it was going to be.
It is indeed. Should we move on to the incident?
Let's do that.
I think... right, before we even start, whose fault is it?
In my opinion, it was Russell's fault. Not Russell's, Bottas's fault.
Oh.
Bottas's fault. Sorry,
Jack, you had two names and you chose the wrong one.
Yeah, I know. It's a lot to think about in that scenario.
Yeah. Personally, I think it's... I would say 60-40 Bottas's fault.
Oh, interesting. See, I thought you were going to side with Bottas.
No.
Because in large...
Initially I did. Initially, I was like, it's Russell's fault.
Okay, why is that?
Because when I saw it initially, as in when you watch the replay, as in ultimately the driver who loses it and therefore not causes the crash, but causes the initial bit of the carnage, was Russell, because he'd obviously gone onto the grass, because you can hear the revs spike, which means that the wheels are spinning, which means that you've lost grip effectively. So Russell must have gone onto the grass, even if it was just a little bit. However, I would say that when you watch the replay, and I guess you could take into context, like, I think it's easy with Formula 1 because they're all driving so quickly all of the time. You feel like they're not actually going that fast, but like when they're going down the straight, you're kind of hitting 180, 190 miles an hour, and all it takes is like something to just put you off a little bit, and you're kind of darting around. And I think Bottas, and this is where I'm kind of torn. I don't know what your thoughts are on this, but like, I don't think Bottas did anything inherently wrong, but he kind of did drift. And I think when he drifted then, that kind of spooked Russell a little bit when you go into those speeds. He kind of jolted a little bit to the right, and then he just dropped the end of the car on the grass. So, I don't know, it's a tough one to call.
To be honest, well, from what I've read so far of what the two of them think, by the sounds of it, Bottas's argument is, I'm driving on the dry patch of the track. That is where the dry track went. I'm going to obviously stick with the dry track. But at the same time, you see someone like Hamilton overtook 6 or 7 people in that exact same section of the circuit. Multiple overtakes were made, and I think the key thing was, in all of those previous ones which didn't have crashes, was people respected the other driver and said, you either pick left, you pick right. Norris was quite savvy. He
put it in the middle.
He put it in the middle and then maybe favoured the left more because he knew that if you're on
the inside.
Yeah, if you got the inside, you can push the other one off in a sense. So maybe Norris was the only person who took a different approach. But, I mean, all Bottas showed was he could see there was a car overtaking him, and he's gone, well, I could stick to a left or right, or I could swerve from the left to the right in a twitchy manner to make sure that I can cover all of it. And he went, well, that's not really how it works. It's like, you've got to leave, especially for a car that's going that much quicker than you, you've got to leave a touch of space.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky, and this is what I can't seem to decide. Like, is it a case that perhaps Russell was a bit naive to try and think that he was just going to be able to breeze past? Equally, when you've got the DRS and you're kind of catching at a rate of knots, Russell's only real alternative is to slam on the brakes, and that's not really the Formula 1 driver thing to do, is it?
No. Well, and the thing is, you shouldn't, as a driver, if there's no other cars around you bar one, there shouldn't be a scenario where if you're on a straight, you have to slam on your brakes. Like, the only times you see that happen is, say, Baku, where you see Ricciardo go into the back of Verstappen, because Verstappen swerved one and then swerved back the other. That is why it's only driver error that should make you brake. And he should have braked, in a sense, because if he did, he wouldn't get crashed. But he only should have had to brake because Bottas was being a bit of a lunatic. But yeah, I personally thought definitely it was Bottas's fault. I mean, I've seen some of the things that Russell said, and they're pretty damning in a sense. He has since sort of withdrawn all of these statements saying it was sort of his fault. But I think that's more Toto Wolff saying, hey, you want to drive for us, you're going to have to take the hit on this one. But he said it was inevitable an incident like this would occur when drivers make small moves like this, suggesting about Bottas's twitch, that is. It was the smallest of moves, but when you're at 220 miles per hour and going 30 miles per hour faster than the car ahead, it's massive. And, can you really blame Russell for saying that? I mean,
no.
His post-race comments were probably even more damning. He said, I was coming up to Valtteri massively fast. I had the slipstream, I had the DRS, and just as I pulled out, he jolted very, very slightly to the right, which was a tactical defence that drivers in the past used to do, maybe suggesting someone like Senna. He was always quite erratic with the steering wheel to keep ahead, but that's not really the kosher thing anymore.
No.
He said, in his eyes, he's not really fighting for anything. That's Bottas now. A P9 for him is nothing, but for us, it's everything. And going for the move would have been absolutely easy, and there's absolutely no reason to jolt like that. So he clearly thinks Bottas is getting a little bit embarrassed by the fact that Russell's going to overtake him here, and he's gone, yeah, I'm going to do something a little bit erratic, because worst case scenario, Russell ends up behind or he crashes into him. But you know what I mean? He knew at that stage anyway, he's just lost out to a Williams.
Yeah. I mean, I think the second part of that statement from George Russell, I think, is redundant. I'll be honest. A P9 for him is nothing. It's like, look, the point to point, right? So I don't think Bottas at no point is thinking, oh, well, it's only ninth, I'll let Russell pass. That's not how Formula 1 drivers work.
No, see, I think it's the other way round. I think more so he thinks a ninth is nothing for Bottas in the sense that it's much worse if Russell overtakes him. So that's why he's done this erratic move, to cause some sort of incident, either to get Russell out or to keep him in the race, or both of them out, and just so he can't be embarrassed by him.
And I mean, this kind of takes us on to our next point, doesn't it? As in, and we kind of alluded to it earlier, but you've got Russell, who's in one of the slower cars, they're probably the second slowest team behind, ahead of Haas.
Yeah.
Only. Maybe.
But to be fair, I think they both out-qualified the Alfa Romeos.
I was about to say, maybe ahead of the Alfa Romeos as well. As in a car that's definitely towards the back of the grid. You've got Bottas, who is in probably the second fastest car, and only just second fastest, I would say. And they're racing for position. Now, where does that leave Bottas?
Yeah, in a very embarrassing situation.
It's a bit precarious, isn't it?
Especially when you think that Hamilton went down to 8th, recovered to 2nd. Bottas started in 8th, went backwards and crashed out. Didn't gain. It's you guys have got identical cars. How is one guy finishing 2nd and the other one crashing out to a Williams?
Yeah, I mean, it's worth noting that Hamilton did have the DRS, whereas Bottas didn't, because obviously of the wet conditions.
Oh, is that true?
Yeah.
Of course, yeah.
So
was it that?
I don't.
They
I'm
still
pretty
off at that stage.
I'm pretty sure that for a lot of the time that Bottas was in that position, they didn't have DRS.
Oh.
But then equally, even without the DRS, like Hamilton was catching drivers because he was having to catch drivers to get within DRS. Do you get
Yeah,
me?
yeah, that's true as well. Yeah, there were stages where there was about 6 seconds to make up, and he was still making those up.
Exactly. So for me, I think it's a bit of success breeds success in that scenario. But is it a case of? And I can't remember I said this too, but are we in the situation now where perhaps Bottas gets found out by not being in the best car? And, all of a sudden, like over the past couple of weeks, you've said, perhaps Mercedes should consider replacing Bottas. And I've turned around and said, well, at the end of the day, the majority of the time last season, it was Hamilton followed by Bottas.
Yeah.
Well, ultimately, if Bottas is going to be qualifying 9th in the second fastest car, that's not good enough.
I mean,
It's
at
really
the end
not
of the
good
day,
enough.
Mercedes as a constructor is only a single point ahead of Red Bull at this stage.
Yeah.
And Perez hasn't finished inside the top 4. He's finished 5th and he's finished 12th. It's like, well, you've been let off a little bit by the fact that Perez has had, first race wasn't really his fault.
First race was unlucky, second race
Second race, he skidded off a few times. And to be fair, he finished both of them. If he finishes just in the points at all, you're level. So it's like, I think Mercedes, I'm sure Mercedes were more than aware that they definitely had more competition this year and definitely were going to have a race on their hands to win it all. But to the degree that it is, I think you're definitely looking at it as Russell in a car which is probably a second slower is beating Bottas. Surely there's got to be crisis talks at this stage to say Bottas is not cutting the mustard by any stretch. I mean, they were saying on that drive to survive, Bottas was like, "Oh, I've got to drive for myself. I want a world championship." There is not a chance that Bottas is going to win a world championship. I don't think in his career. When you look at the performances he's been putting in, it's like there is a gulf between him and probably about 6 of the other drivers. He's a long way off being the best driver unless he's in that Mercedes. Hamilton isn't in the Mercedes, and someone partnering him is, say, someone like Giovinazzi, for instance, or a rookie driver. I don't think there's a chance that you're going to see Bottas winning a world championship anytime soon. That's my thoughts on Bottas.
There we are. Yeah, I can't argue with that at all. Right, should we move on to next topic of discussion?
Let's do that.
So you put some of the changes, last week in the preview. We discussed how the DRS section had changed slightly. And the kind of like big speed bump style things.
Do you think those changes worked?
I mean, the DRS thing, I don't really... Maybe a little bit.
Well, there was a lot more overtakes.
Yeah.
Like, in a sense, if that... Like, every overtake that was being made was, by the skin of its teeth almost, quite a lot. Maybe apart from Hamilton, who was thrashing people through there. But for everybody else, it was always right on the limit. You're going into that turn pretty much neck and neck, and it's driver's skill. And I think personally, the DRS worked. I think that just extra couple of 150 metres of DRS zone allowed for more overtakes. I think it was a good improvement.
Yeah, I guess the thing I always have with DRS is that there's a little part of me that is as beneficial as it is for overtaking. It is artificial, and I'm not sure how much I like that. But, and I guess we'll kind of allude to this later in terms of Imola as a track. Like, there's a part of me that thinks there aren't really that many overtaking opportunities at Imola, so I guess it is kind of necessary.
Yeah, you don't want people just to be given overtakes for the sake of overtakes, but at the same time, on a circuit like Imola, you kind of
if the alternative is no overtakes at all, then that's not exactly the ideal scenario
to be
either.
Fair, it wasn't just you have DRS, you overtake. You still had to be within, say, 0.6, 0.7 of the driver ahead. It wasn't just inside a second, you got it. You still had tough overtake.
Yeah, you still had to be well within a second, didn't you, to kind of make the overtake stick. In terms of the speed bump things, I wish I knew exactly what they were called. But you know what we're talking about.
They're big and yellow brick road.
I think they worked, and I think the clarity of the rules was just so much better.
Yeah.
Like, how
people
nice
generally
is it?
getting penalties, and it was like you could hear them on the audio saying, if you get another one, you're going to get a penalty, and then you see Sonoda get one. You're like, well, it's good to see it enforced and carried out.
Yeah, definitely.
But yeah, also going back to the yellow brick roads, they definitely worked, because even if it was like 50-50 and you go, oh, he's not really on the track there, it's like, yeah, he's not really on the track this time, but he's going airborne, losing parts of his car. I think people quickly learn how to drive the circuit that way. It's a brutal way to learn, but it is a way to learn.
Yeah. Go on.
Well, I've put it as next question, but do you want to see Imola on the calendar next year?
My thoughts would be this. If the car regulations, that is, would stay in the same, I'd say no. But given that the cars are likely going to be a lot smaller next year,
are they? I didn't know that was part of the regulation.
Yeah. Okay. If you look at the difference in the size of the cars, it's pretty dramatic. I would say potentially, depending on if it was replacing another track, like Canada, for example. If Canada was going, then I wouldn't be too disappointed, because it's a bit of a boring circuit.
It doesn't look like it's even going to go ahead at this stage, does it?
No, there's problems with finances and stuff, weren't there? But I'm sure we'll talk about that in upcoming weeks. But I mean, I'm a little bit. I don't know, purely because I think going back to what I said about the DRS, and I feel like when you think about all of the overtakes that happened in the race, can you remember an overtake that didn't happen on that straight?
No. I don't think. Well, there probably was a few, but very hard to pick them out.
And if they were, it would have been from drivers like running wide and then somebody just nipping up the inside, rather than like wheel to wheel racing. The only wheel to wheel, like the proper wheel to wheel racing we got, was Hamilton and Verstappen at the start. And as soon as they went wheel to wheel, they were too wide for the track, and Hamilton had to go over the yellow brick road.
Yeah, that's true. That was the only time we saw it. That's a good point. Yeah, there we go. I saw it on the first lap. I did. That was where I saw some overtaking. After that, I didn't see any.
Yeah. In terms of driver of the weekend, then, who would you say is your driver of the weekend?
Definitely Lando Norris. I think he was just the most complete driver of the weekend. He definitely was, in terms of individual drivers, he was the quickest driver of the weekend, first and foremost. I think you give him the best car, he's winning that. If everyone has the same car, he's winning that this weekend. And he had a stellar qualifying. He was very unlucky. And in the race, he showed it. The fact that he was the only person who could go head-to-head with Hamilton for multiple laps. He was the only person who could do it, and I think he showed that he was definitely right up there. What about you?
Yeah. I mean, I was going to say Carlos Sainz, but he did have a pretty dreadful qualifying, to be honest. As in, to not even finish in the top 10 is a little bit... It's not ideal, really. So I'd probably... To be honest, I know this is not really how we do things on this podcast, but I would probably agree with you on Lando Norris. Mm-hmm. I think it was
such a good performance.
Yes, it was a complete performance, really, from Lando Norris. Which, as much as I like Lando Norris, it hurts me to say, because I'm also a big Danny Rick fan. But I
think you can be a Lando Norris and a Danny Rick fan. I wouldn't hold that against you.
Oh,
but I know what you mean.
I'm glad you wouldn't hold it against me.
Yeah.
So we can do this podcast again next week, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
On this issue,
you'll let me off.
Yeah, I will let you have that one.
You'll let it slide. Okay, thanks. In terms of disappointment of the weekend, then?
Do you want to go first on this one?
Does it have to be a team? Or
it can be an individual. I put a team.
Bottas, then.
Bottas.
Straight up Bottas. I'm sorry, if you're in a Mercedes, to not even be able to overtake like Lance Stroll,
but to be overtaken.
Yeah, exactly. To be overtaken. I think what you saw on the weekend was about as big a gulf as we've seen between Hamilton. And this is why, when people always used to say to me, oh, well, Hamilton only wins because he's in the fastest car. It's like, this is showing that when they're not in the fastest car, the gulf between the two is, like, between Bottas and Hamilton is night and day. They're just not they're not on the same level.
At the same time, I would say that Hamilton's gone from 8th to 2nd because of the car. He would obviously have gained some positions by himself, but by and large, I do think the car was the main component to that.
I would say it was a component. I wouldn't say it was the main component. Because again, if it was the main component, why is Bottas being nearly overtaken by a Williams?
Because Bottas isn't a top 16 driver.
Yeah, there we go. Exactly. So yeah, for me, the biggest disappointment of the weekend was Bottas.
Okay. My biggest disappointment of the weekend was the AlphaTauri team. This was, I mean, Ferrari's home Grand Prix is Monza, so I don't think AlphaTauri can claim that, despite being an Italian team. But this is their home circuit because their factory is 10 miles down the road from Imola. So going into this, you thought, they've got something to prove here, but they were rubbish. Sonoda, he's had a load of practice laps at this place in pre-season because obviously the new drivers are allowed to, or the new drivers, the new teams in a sense, are allowed to have a couple of practice laps in an old version of their car, and they did that. You saw it on the Formula One channel. You see some of these laps that he was doing. Looked good and all that, but he crashed out in qualifying. I think he skidded off at one point in the race as well. Ended up finishing, not in the points at the very least. And then Pierre Gasly. To be fair, I don't think this one's so much on Gasly because I don't think Gasly had a bad performance. He qualified 5th, very well done, especially when your teammate's not even qualifying at all. And everybody was on the intermediates. I mean, I don't know how much information teams are given about the other teams in terms of what tyre strategies they're going for. So perhaps there's a little bit of obscurity as to what teams are doing. But surely, looking at that circuit, it just wasn't worth going to start on the wet tyres. Only tyre, well, apart from the Alpine and Haas, two teams that were already at the back, so they had to take a gamble. Apart from them, nobody else started on the wets.
Yeah,
and it's why are you picking for a 5th place driver?
The thing was as well, you can understand why they wanted to take a gamble because I think AlphaTauri were probably hoping they would have been a little bit further ahead than they actually were.
Yeah.
But within a lap, Ocon was in. He was going straight onto the intermediates. They left Gasly out for like I said, I think they said
just
at one
kept
point
preying on the rain, weren't they?
At one point, they said Gasly was costing drivers 8 seconds a lap.
Yeah, because they were all getting held up behind him. There were loads
and
of them, and obviously you can't overtake very easily.
And I can understand they were kind of hoping, that they could eke it out long enough that they could pit and then do a one stop. But I was you're just flogging a dead horse here. Just get him in, get him on the intermediates.
The thing is, what was fortunate for Ocon was that he did it so early, and I think there was a little bit of. I think there was a safety car pretty early on.
Yeah, it benefited
because of Latifi. So it meant he caught up.
Yeah.
And that is exactly why you instantly switch up when you know something's gone wrong. I mean, we drive on the Formula One game together on occasion, and quite often we've said you've got a damage.
Well, hang on. Let's just clarify this. When you say together, we're on the same race, on the same track. Yeah. You're normally about a minute and a half down the road compared to me.
Up ahead, you mean, yeah?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Down the road behind is not the case. I am winning these things. But if you got damaged wing, we always just suggest get in the pits because it's just not worth trying to cling on for dear life because you end up doing yourself more harm down the road, especially when situations change. You can catch up and then it's a new race all of a sudden. But yeah, they just kept him out of the fit ages. It just...
Yeah.
And especially, I mean, we spoke earlier about McLaren and Ferrari. I can't remember in what context to do with mitigating the risks per se. I think it was more so because it was Norris. And we were talking about he could have sort of hung the car out there and tried to push Hamilton a little bit wide, but then you run the risk of not finishing entirely. So you don't do that. You say we'll take our 3rd place and we'll go home. Thank you very much. But in the case of AlphaTauri, you start 5th. Every other driver in the top 10 bar Ocon is on intermediates and you've chosen wets. It's just go with the status quo and let your driver prove himself on the track. If you think you can beat them, if you genuinely think they're living on a prayer at the moment and that's the only reason they're up there, sure, maybe do that. But from the evidence that we've seen from the first two races, Gasly twice now has been royally done over, either because his front wing fell off in the first one, which was very unfortunate, or by strategy. It's like, just do what everyone else does, and you're going to come away with something. They are now, I think Gasly, well, they have picked up points. I think Gasly actually ended up finishing in the top 10. I think he ended up getting 8th after Raikkonen's penalty, late
debacle.
Penalty. So, obviously, in the context of that, they've been fortunate that they've got anything. But, I mean, this is a team which really has a strong chance of finishing fifth this year, which is, about 2 positions higher than they probably would have anticipated going into the season. And at this current present in mind, if they don't sort out strategy, they're not gonna. And they can't be taking gambles like this every week.
No.
Got to sort it out.
Got to sort it out. Agreed. Finally then, shall we move on to Sergio Perez?
Yeah, let's do that.
To finish off?
Yeah, because, I mean, we have spoken about Bottas and how he's been a gulf behind Hamilton. But then you think of Perez, he qualified second. Mm-hmm. First time I think somebody's qualified ahead of Verstappen. That is in the Red Bull. Since 2018, I think.
It's Daniel Ricciardo.
Since the Daniel. Wow. That was 2 drivers ago.
Yeah. To be fair though, it's 2 drivers, but like 1.5 seasons.
Yeah. That's true. but yeah, it was an interesting race for him. He didn't have the best of starts. Him and Verstappen sort of went either side of Hamilton, and I think when it came to that corner, Verstappen definitely got the better of it. And then I think when you see Hamilton's already occupying the yellow brick road, Perez has nowhere to go, so he has to break.
No,
and I think he lost his position to Leclerc at that stage. He span. I think not span. He went off twice. Once under the safety car, once during the actual race. Got a 10-second penalty because he retook those positions, which he shouldn't have when he went off under the safety car. And he still he finished 12th in the end. So such a bizarre. So much promise in a driver to just have all of that go wrong. I mean, I feel like he was unfortunate on the 10-second thing because I think you could be forgiven for overtaking those guys again and then just sort of in a way thinking, I'm meant to go back ahead, aren't I? And then not. And it's like, you couldn't correct it quick enough.
Although I feel like Perez has been in Formula 1 long enough to know that.
But to be honest, under that circumstance, I thought, he's allowed to overtake him again as long as it's before the thing. But must be a rule. I think they did say if you go past there's a safety car line, and I think once you go past there, your position is locked, regardless if you spin off. In a sense, you can regain if you can up to that point. But yeah, he was nowhere near that stage at that point.
I think the thing to consider with Perez as well is I think as good a performance as it was in qualifying, I think that flattered him a little bit. Mm-hmm. Just because
I do feel that circuit was, especially when you're going to get 2 laps or 2 runs at it on that final qualifying. That was why I was saying it should be a bit longer, because you just find if somebody doesn't, goes off the track, it's invalidated. You only have one more chance. And if you nail it once by pure fluke, just by clawing on for dear life all the way around, you can end up quite high up. And perhaps that is why he was up there, because he definitely wasn't looking particularly sharp over the weekend, I wouldn't have said.
I mean, but I guess it flatters because if you think about it, it was in Hamilton on his second attempt at a fast lap was slower than his first attempt, and Verstappen botched his fastest lap, which left him in third. So I think realistically, and you've also got to consider that Norris potentially went fast enough, maybe not to go second, but as in to get himself in the top 4.
But his time was quicker than Perez's, but obviously,
yes,
if he stays on the track.
I guess what I mean is in you're talking a couple of inches. Yeah. How much time does a couple of inches gain you? Okay, it does gain you some time, but probably not enough to warrant dropping from 2nd to 7th.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think that is worth considering. But Perez had. It's bizarre. Perez it's almost like he only seems to turn up when he's at the back of the grid.
Yeah. To be honest, though,
he's only had 2 races with Red Bull. There's plenty of time.
His qualities have usually come in the race.
Yes.
And it showed that last week, and qualifying he wasn't particularly good last week. This week it was the flip. He was better in the qualifying and did not have
So what he needs to do now is turn up for qualifying and the race.
Or don't do either, and then the next week come back. You know what I mean? If it's maybe double down on the badness one week so you can, win something the next week.
I'm going to have a stinker this week. I'm going to have a stinker this week, lads, and I'm going to get a Grand Slam next week.
It's like, lads, do you want 2 5th places in a row, or do you want a 12th and then a first, eh?
P1.
So we want a 12th and a first.
P1 in quali, fastest lap, P1 in the race. That's what's happening next week after my stinker. There we are. We haven't got anything else to talk about, so I think we'll probably wrap the podcast up there, shall we?
Let's do that.
Let's do that. Thank you very much for listening. As I said, we will be... I've lost my train of thought. We'll be back later this week to talk about the European Super League. As we've been recording this podcast,
I was like, ooh!
Yeah, things have been absolutely kicking off. We won't say anything because we'll save it all for... I think Thursday's the day we're recording, isn't it? So we'll save it all for Thursday and we'll have a good old chinwag about that then. So if you've been listening on YouTube, thanks for listening. Why not subscribe so you can get updated with all of the sporting talk. Also, we are on Spotify, so if you've been listening on Spotify, why not give us a follow? We're also on Breaker, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Anchor. Have I forgotten any?
Pocket Casts. Don't know if you said that.
I may have said Pocket Casts.
Oh, okay, fair.
But yeah, we're on all of those. Pleasure as always, Jack, and we shall speak to you next time.